Now in this next section we get to the importance of context. We're now on page 301. This first example, just a couple of sentences into the text at the very top of that page, is a fascinating one, and because we've already dealt so much with the horse raced sentence, I'm going to read it now. Farmer Bill and Farmer John were racing their horses through the field. Farmer Bill rode his horse along the fence, while Farmer John raced his horse past the barn. Suddenly, the horse raced past the barn fell. All of a sudden, that same sentence that we read at the beginning of the chapter, the horse raced past the barn fell, makes so much better sense. And the reason why is because we can use these contextual cues to infer something about that sentence that we couldn't have inferred without those cues. We know that there are two horses in this situation, the one that's being raced by Farmer Bill and the one that's being raced by Farmer John. We also know now that they're being raced because Farmer Bill and Farmer John were racing them. We also know that one of them was being raced past the barn, but one of them was being raced somewhere else. So when we get to this sentence, the horse raced past the barn, then we know that this is a modifier talking about the horse, telling us which horse fell. It's the horse that was being raced past the barn. So all of a sudden, this sentence sounds so much more logical than it ever did before. And we don't have the same garden path, we don't get stuck on it in the same garden pathway that we would have before. There are other examples of contextual cues described here. For instance, there's on page 302, there's an image here of an apple on a towel and just a towel and then a pencil and a box. And when the sentence is said, let's see, put the apple on the towel into the box, our first inclination is to put the apple on the towel. But when we hear put the apple on the towel into the box, then that last phrase, into the box, helps us to realize, or upon hearing it I should say, we do realize that something was wrong with the beginning of the sentence. We didn't process the beginning of the sentence how the author intended it. And we realize then that if we realize at that point that that on the towel was a referential part of the apple, just talking about the apple itself. It was describing which apple. This situation here in panel A leads to a garden path effect. But in panel B, where there are two apples, there is no garden path effect. The same sentence all of a sudden doesn't yield confusion. It's not ambiguous. And here's why. We look at these two apples that are present there in panel B, and we say, one of those apples must be the one that this person is talking about. How do I know which one? I'm going to listen for cues. Put the apple on the towel into the box. All of a sudden, the individual knows, upon hearing put the apple on the towel, which apple is being described. It's the one on the towel. And there's no confusion there about which apple should or shouldn't be used, because the phrase on the towel is used as a referential component of towel. And so we have we see there in the graph underneath panel B that the garden path effect disappears in this situation, that all of a sudden there's no delay in being able to understand what was meant in this context. Furthermore, if we look at these arrows, this is demonstrating eye gaze in the experiment. The plus in the center is a fixation cross. it's where the individual was looking before the pictures appeared. So even though it's still there in this illustration, when the subject saw the pictures of the apple and the towel, it actually disappeared. So it's just telling us where the participants were looking at first when the computer screen was blank, and then the fixation cross would have disappeared, and the participant's eye gaze is measured. In panel A, the participant looks first from the fixation cross to the apple, to the towel, back to the apple, to the box. That takes a significantly longer amount of time than the fixations in panel B, where the individual looks from the fixation cross to the apple on the bottom, then to the apple on the towel, then to the box. The individual doesn't have as many confused gazes, because in that situation there's the phrase on the towel has a point. There's a reason for it to be there. Now, one final note. If we look at the data in panel A along that line, you can see that the second example of a sentence that was the control sentence that researchers used was, put the apple that's on the towel in the box. Using that phrase, that's on the towel, just all they did was to add the word that, and by adding the word that, they were able to eliminate the garden path effect in the eye gaze, but not actually in the time it took. So still there's processing, still there's an extended amount of processing that's going on, because putting the phrase that's on the towel in the first situation is irrelevant. It's irrelevant because there's only one apple. So participants in panel A, they already are assuming, of course, there's only one apple, so there's no reason to describe that it's on the towel. So it still confuses them to some extent, but their eye gaze doesn't demonstrate so much confusion as it did in the ambiguous version. Put the apple on the towel in the box. There's another example here that's described. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it's also a fascinating one. It suggests that when an egg is in its shell, that participants hear some detail about the egg, the fact that it's in the bowl, and they wonder why is that additional information needed if there's only one egg that can be poured, the one in the bowl, because the other is in the shell. So they fixate longer on this on the ambiguous phase, on the ambiguous phrase, and there anyway, it's just you can read that a little bit in a little bit more detail and understand it, but it's also a contextual experiment that suggests that we can take cues, visual cues, and contextual cues to influence our first pass processing of a sentence.